This podcast will be really casual. It's more just a conversation and just to hear your thoughts on really how to ask good questions. Because as a journalist, I think you walk a fine line between getting as much information as possible, but at the same time trying to make it succinct for everyone to consume it. So I thought it'd be good to pick your brain and really get the enough information so that we can practice it on our end as well. So before we even get to all of that, perhaps you can give us a brief idea of, how you got started in broadcast journalism.
I was quite a career path sort of change, I guess, a change of direction. I moved to Singapore about 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, actually. And I sort of had an opportunity, a clean slate. We came over to Singapore because my wife got a job offer over here. And I'd always wanted to be a sports presenter, love sport. What better job than if you can't be a professional sports person, then talking about sports got to be the second job in the world, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so I got a job. I won a competition, an online competition, and the first prize was to present on ESPN's Sports Center, and that led to being able to work at Sports Center. So I got really lucky and sort of got my first break into it through that competition, and it sort of gave me a taste for maybe I could be a presenter. It doesn't necessarily have to be sport; it could be anything. So I sort of sent a blind message on LinkedIn to the MD of Channel News Asia and said, "Hey, I'm looking for more opportunities to present. I'm currently working at ESPN." And then a couple of days later, their HR called me in for an interview, did a screen test, and that was it. That was 8 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's been a series of very unusual and very fortunate events. I feel very lucky. I am very lucky to be where I am today.
Yeah, as with anything in life, right? Sometimes, the path is forged for you. But
you got to take a chance. I mean, the online competition that got me sort of started on this path was just me messing around and goofing around in an empty room at home, and I didn't know where that was going to lead, but it sort of led me up to ESPN, and then ESPN led me to CNA. So yeah, it's you don't know how it. Didn't think I was going to be here, but here I am. They're very different. I used to come from the corporate world. I used to work at the Economic Development Board back in Brunei. So very big departure.
Yeah, and I'm just curious because when you were on set at ESPN, what was that feeling like? Because I'm sure a lot of boyhood memories come into play, but at the same time, you must have been nervous as well, right?
Oh yeah, I was incredibly nervous. I'd been watching that show for years beforehand, and when we were thinking about coming to Singapore, my wife sort of said, "So what do you think you're going to do when we get there?" And we were watching Sports Center, and I said, "I want that job. I want to do what those guys are doing." And I really didn't think it was going to happen, and it was really quite incredible that it did. But I remember being really nervous. The problem I have when I'm nervous is on the outside, I look really calm. So to everyone watching and to the bosses that were at ESPN as well, their concern was that I didn't look like I was enthused enough. I wasn't excited enough, but really I was over the moon and totally excited. It's just when I get nervous, I tend to look very calm, which I suppose lends itself well to hard news that I'm doing now.
Yeah.
When things are happening and there's a lot of really heavy sort of stuff happening. But yeah, for sports news, that wasn't quite so great, and it took me a while, as it does with everything, right? I mean, I was sort of coming into it in my early 30s and was presenting alongside people that had done it for decades, so it was a little bit intimidating at first, to be sure. And but it was a lot of fun. And I mean, your homework, your prep for work is watching sport.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't. If you're a sports lover, it doesn't get any better.
Yeah, it is. I mean, as you said rightly, it is a bit of a dream job if you love sports because, you always try to analyze literally every part of the game with your friends, and then to be able to do it, for work, that must be a dream.
That's right, and then you get to interview the athletes or the sports stars or the footballers to sort of get their thoughts on it as well. It's like you're in Wonderland. It was I've had similar opportunities at CNA as well. I presented the Football World Cup for MediaCorp.
I remember that.
Yeah, so that was, and I wouldn't have gotten that job if they didn't know that I had come from ESPN before.
Right.
So
Okay.
they said, "Oh, you like sport?" I'm like, "Yeah, huh, I like sport." And by the way, I used to present sport back in the day. So yeah, so it was because of the ESPN experience that I got to present the World Cup. And other than the Olympics, I think the World Cup is probably the biggest. Actually, the World Cup is probably the biggest. It has
Yeah.
a bigger, everyone there's a lot more concentration around the world on the Football World Cup because the Olympics is spread over so many different events. So,
Yeah.
so the Football World Cup, presenting that was a absolutely bucket list dream come true. It was incredible. Yeah.
That's awesome. Who's
Getting way off topic, by the
no, no,
way.
that's okay. I'm getting engrossed because I mean, I grew up with football, so and the thought of being a sports pundit will always cross your mind because you can never be a sports star. But I'm curious, like who is someone that you've interviewed that you were starstruck and awestruck, when you met them and spoke to them.
Yeah, it's a weird thing when you work in the job. It's like that feeling of like, wow, I just met whoever only comes afterwards. It comes like before and it comes afterwards, but during, I mean, you kind of very quickly realize, hey, they're just a normal guy, just chatting,
Right.
and or a normal lady, and it's so the before and after. I guess you can sort of you build it up in your mind, and then afterwards you kind of reevaluate what just happened. But in the moment, you find yourself just having a normal conversation with just someone who is of like mind. Like for example, for the World Cup, I used sport again for another example. We had Darren Anderton, Teddy Sheringham, and Ian Rush as our pundits for the
Wow.
for the for the World Cup.
Yeah.
And what the most I had pinched myself afterwards because I mean Teddy Sheringham I thought was I mean, he's a really smart guy. He really knows his stuff, very articulate and very sort of easy to chat with, and knows his like I said he knows his stuff. And it was great doing all the on air stuff. Talking to him, throwing him questions, getting his thoughts on what he thinks Gareth Southgate's waistcoat was like. Just
Yeah.
little things like that because he himself turned up for the show in a waistcoat. So I thought, oh, you're supporting Gareth, sure, clearly. I
Yeah.
mean, but he's English anyway, so he would be. But actually, the most fun stuff was actually after we're off air. After we've done the pre-show and the game starts, and we just sat in a green room watching the game. So I'm just sat there with next to Teddy Sheringham,
Wow.
and it was and just like so when Gareth was playing, what was he like? And you're just asking all these little questions that don't really have a relevance to the what you're there for. But when else are you going to have a chance to ask these guys these sorts of questions? Yeah, so that sort of thing was quite remarkable. Yeah, I
Wow.
found that quite fun, just hanging out and just talking football and getting his thoughts on different players and stuff from his generation. Yeah.
That's wow. That's amazing. Yeah, I think it's also interesting as you rightly pointed out because when you're I guess when you're on and when you have to interview them, you treat them as normal people. But then
Mm.
I suppose when you sit right next to them, you realize like just how much experience they have in the game and how much they must know about this secret world behind the scenes that we've been trying to get access to.
Yeah, that's right. They have like so many little stories and anecdotes, and like he was saying off air that Gareth was always quite a different kind of footballer to the majority of footballers out there, especially in
Yeah.
the English footballers. He was a lot more like a lot more of a thinker, a lot more considered. Yeah, so he was not surprised that he went into management, and not surprised as well that he's been doing as well as he has. He said he was a very unique footballer
Yeah.
for his time. Yeah, just incredibly unfortunate with the penalty misses, right? In the
Yeah.
so, and that's sort of the memory people have of him to a certain extent. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't think they can hold him to it because England misses every penalty. So I mean,
They banished. They put that one to bed at the last World Cup. So
okay, yeah,
yeah.
that's true. That's true. But I mean, okay, so with interviewing sports stars to interviewing people on CNA, I mean,
Mm.
is it hard to have to listen knowing that you have to immediately ask them a follow-up question? Because I always find that a struggle as well, right? Because I want to listen and absorb what they have to say, but at the same time I'm already preparing a rebuttal or a follow-up question. um I don't know, how do you kind of deal with that so that you can absorb as much as you give out?
Yeah, so listening and talking at the same time are things we kind of have to do in the newsroom. I mean, it's not just where we're listening to the guest give us an answer. We're
Yeah.
also listening to people in the studio or in the gallery. telling us, okay, after this, we're going to go to this story, or that next story is dropped. We're moving another story up, or the connection is, might drop at any time. Get ready to just cut in, or, there's a lot going on. We're sort of listening to two different things at the same time and trying to sort of get our heads right. But you sort of go in fairly prepared, right? Like you kind of know where you want to go with the conversation. You want to sort of set the scene. You want to ask about one specific area, and then you want to follow up, or you might want to follow up on that in a different. So you kind of go in prepared. It's like we're chatting now. You want to ask me about how I got into the game, or how I got into presenting, how I, what it is, the actual job like. What's it like when you're in the chair versus, pre-show, that kind of stuff. So you kind of know where you want the conversation to go. And obviously you've read around the subject, you know what you're talking about. So you kind of go in with that. And then to a certain extent, you kind of have to let it be a conversation as well. So there are some times when you have a sequence of questions, but in their first answer, they've mentioned your third or fourth question. So you might just jump straight to that then, like, oh, well, seeing as you've mentioned XYZ, what do you think about, this as the impact of that? So there's an element of fluidity to it that comes with just conversation. So you'll find the best interviewers are the ones that are just really good conversationalists, are really good at just listening, and are really good at being able to take someone in a certain direction, or expound on something, or notice that they've just said something really interesting, even though it's not what you want to ask next. And then trusting yourself that is also going to be something that the listener or the viewer is also going to be interested in. But that all comes with knowing what your interviewer is going to be talking about. So the subject matter, I guess, and knowing as well what, but if it sparks your interest, there's a good chance. And, if it sparks your interest, there's a good chance it'll spark whoever's watching it as well, because, you're there to be the advocate for the person at home, right?
Right.
So I try not to get too bogged down with I'm going to ask 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's like, I'm going to ask this.
Yes.
This bundle of questions and bundle of thoughts. And then we'll get through them depending on how the answers come. Because you don't want to, because it helps for the person that's also giving the answers, that they can also follow the train of thinking, right? So if they've answered your first question about why something has happened, and then they've given you a thought of that, and then suddenly you've jumped to your second question, which is nothing to do with the direction they were heading in, then they've got to recalibrate and reset and think, oh, okay, so we're not talking about that anymore. Now you're asking me about this. So the idea is for it, like we're doing this podcast, the very first thing you said is you want it to be as conversational as possible. So by doing that, we are, by very nature, working through what you want to do, but also you're allowing me to go off in different directions to sort of make a point, or if something that sort of occurs to me but hasn't occurred to you, or vice versa.
Right. And it's interesting because as you said that, towards the start of your turn to speak, you said something that I wanted to follow up on, and I forgot already what I was supposed to say.
That's the problem when someone talks for too long.
No. But and it's a beautiful segue, because I actually wanted to ask you about that, right? So, like, what if you had this amazing question in your mind? Like, how do you try to remember it so that by the end of the conversation, you can bring it back into the fray?
Yeah, so that's, I guess, I mean, there's no harm in writing down. If you have a pen or paper, you can always make a note of it, or just flag it. Or if it's in your list of questions, you can just underline. Maybe it was the third question, but you wanted to bring it up, because you're not always on air. Like if the guest is talking, the camera's on them, so you have, you can look down and do a few things. But it has happened before. Also, the shows that I present on CNA, they're two co-hosts. I have a co-host, Glenda Chong or Dawn Tan. So we tend to alternate questions, just so that everybody has a bit of airtime. So sometimes I'll follow up on her question, or riff on it that way. But sometimes you ask a question because you want to get it to somewhere else. And then, of course, you're not asking the next question. So then Glenda or Dawn takes the conversation in a different direction, and you're like, oh no, I'm not going to get a chance to get back to that. But that's I guess the nature of when you have two people asking questions. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the viewer, it adds variety and a different voice, and so it's not always a bad thing at all. And we're always on the same page with what we want to get out of the guest. It's
Yeah.
just I might think that we have a bit more time on one area, and they might think, no, we've got to move on and get to the next topic. So, and in TV, we only ever have like 5 to 7 minutes with someone, which is not a lot of time if you think about it. And we have to try and get as much information out of them as possible in the most sort of succinct way.
Yeah. And I don't know if you remember this, but I think it was 2018, I actually came on your show for the Beyond the Label campaign. I mean, you probably don't remember because you have like millions of guests, but it was me and the president or CEO of IMH, and we had this talk segment for Beyond the Label. And I remember thinking, like, because I got a list of questions that I was supposed to answer or to expect from both you and I can't remember who was the co-host at that time. And I remember thinking, I don't know if I have enough time to be to provide you with all the answers that you want me to give. So I guess that's my long way of coming back to the main question, which is, how do you, knowing that you have that 5 or 7 minute segment, or with any conversation, you don't want it to grind for too long.
Yeah.
How do you ask a question and in a way that helps them be succinct, short, and sharp?
Yeah, that's a very tough one because you can only control the question. So you can ask a question that is short. You can even preempt it by saying, just quickly sum up for us, your thoughts on this. So you can frame it in that way. If you want them to be really succinct, you can say in 10 words or less, what in the nuts and bolts of it, what's this, what is that? You can do it that way. But it can be tough. I mean, a lot of the time, especially I find with academics that are very professorial, that are very used to they have to give you the context, give you the background, and then feed in their point, and then run through the ramifications and the implications of all the stuff that they're talking about and all that that means. That can be quite tough. So sometimes you might have to interject. You might have to say, just to sum up quickly, then you're saying, and then use your words to sum up what they've said to try and get the conversation to sort of keep moving. As much as possible, we try and let people sort of say their piece and say it in their own words. But for TV, we are very short for time. But we generally, I guess, you want to be respectful too. So it's a delicate a line to walk, I suppose.
Right. Does it help? I mean, knowing when to ask. Well, I suppose when you have like 5, 7 minute segments, you only have that much time. How?
We do tell them going in how much time they have. So
okay. Yeah.
So when they come in and we're saying hi, have a seat, we'll say hi. We're just warming up, just making small talk and stuff. Said, thanks for coming in. We've only got you for 6 minutes, so we want to make the most to get the most out of you. We've got 5 questions to go through. So 45 seconds to a minute answers, and then we'll sort of keep the conversation going. So you kind of set them up, sort of preempt them of what you're hoping to get out of the conversation. That is the ideal situation. Like if they come in during a commercial break or a longer package and you have a few minutes just to chat.
Yeah.
If they're sort of brought in while you're talking on air and they sit down and then suddenly you're into the conversation, you've got no chance to have that little sort of preamble. But if they know going in what you're trying to get out of them, then they usually accommodate. And the ones that have done this before, we have a lot of recurring guests that come on, so they're a bit more TV savvy by now, and they'll know that, okay, a minute and a half for an answer is good. If they're still talking after like 2.5 minutes, then we're not going to get through like 2 or 3 of the questions that we want to get through. So it's usually the newbies and the new guys that are that are the academics, that are the ones that are more prone to being long-winded.
Right.
And it's not always a bad thing. If they're engaging and they're really smart and they're saying really important things, then by all means, go for it. It's just we have to be mindful of time and to keep things moving along, because it's for a 1-hour show, we usually have like 4 or 5 live crosses. We've got correspondents waiting on the line to speak to us. We've got a lot of things that we're juggling in the air. So
Yeah.
it's there's a lot going on in that 1 hour.
Yeah, I definitely imagine it being hard to navigate, being to managing all the things that are all the moving parts that are happening, and also being respectful for what they have to say.
Yeah.
Uh, um, I suppose what's really interesting in your position, especially as a presenter and someone who interviews guests, there are some touchy topics that will definitely come across your desk. I mean, how do you get people comfortable enough to open up to you about, those tricky topics and subjects?
Well, the good news is they've already agreed to come on the show, right? So they
Yeah,
kind of know why they're there. So if a topic is sensitive, they've already in their mind gone through how they want to approach it or how they want to say it. Our job is to maybe just sort of coax them along and make sure they're comfortable. And we're not overly confrontational on our programs because we're not paying these guests to appear. They're usually making their own effort to come to the studio to talk to us, or phone in via online or however we speak to them. So we kind of see them as our partners in helping our audience understand a story. We're not like interviewing mass murderers, or it's not. We're very rarely interviewing controversial figures.
right.
Um, we usually have guests that are there to help the audience understand a topic better. So if the topic itself is tricky, then they already know that coming in. And if we have a chance to preamble and to go through it, then to chat before we have the interview, which is always really helpful, then we'll map out for them, like, we know this is sensitive, but it's very important that we talk about this point. And the point for us is not to be confrontational. I mean, we can challenge, their assumptions or their thinking for sure. But if you're talking about like conflict or, getting into a shouting match on TV, that's very rarely going to happen for us, because we know that conflict like that comes a lot of it is with tone of voice, right?
Yeah,
The manner in which you ask the question is more important sometimes than the actual words that you're using.
right.
So if so I find by breaking the ice before they've come in, when they've come in, by running through what we're going to be talking about and setting them at ease. But even if we're asking them a difficult question about a difficult subject, we're not couching that question in an accusation in any way. We're doing it as a way to help explain to our audience, why this is important to know. And if we are challenging what they're saying, then we have to do it in a way that is, that we back it up with justification for it. But also, we're not there to antagonize or to build a conflict, which is quite different, I suppose, from a lot of news networks that thrive on the conflict,
Right.
of disagreeing. I mean, you can disagree and still have a conversation.
Yes.
But a lot of news organizations, particularly in the US, they're driven by having conflict on air, because that's how they get eyeballs and ratings. And you can sort of see how the US media scene sort of plays out and feeds into that. But that's not really what we want to be doing. We want to be helping our viewers understand topics and understand stories that are happening.
Yeah.
So that doesn't necessarily come with conflict in
Yeah.
the same way that it would for other news organizations.
Right. That's interesting. So, I mean, you alluded to it a little, but what's a good way to challenge them and to get them to answer, perhaps, or to get them to prove their point in a way that's, I suppose, satisfying to you, whether you
Yeah.
agree with it or not.
Yeah, I guess that way you need to know the topic, right? Like, you can't just ask a question and then they give an answer that you kind of vaguely know is not right, but you don't know why you know that.
Yes. Yes.
So, I mean, otherwise you can't challenge them, right? So if they've said like they say statement X, and you say, well, actually, I have a quote here from you from 2 years ago that you actually said the complete opposite. So how has your position changed since then? So you kind of need to be prepared. So I would say that the best way to be able to do that with someone is to go into the interview in a very prepared way, to know in advance, sort of to think ahead of what do you think they're going to say for this answer, and then if that's not going to be consistent with what that their position may have been in the past, or what the facts have borne out,
Yeah.
and you need to have that ready at hand. so that you can challenge it and point it to something specific. Rather, I mean, you can't just say, "I don't believe you. You're going to have to convince me more with that." I mean, that it is. I mean, just those words, even the way I've just said it, and you could, that's already going to get someone's backup, right?
Yeah.
But, and also, if you're listening at home, you'll be like, "Yeah, okay, but what are you backing that up on? Like,
Yeah.
why are you thinking that?" So, I guess being prepared, but also, you can ask a question that's challenging, and you can disagree with someone, and it be civil. There's no
Yeah.
harm in that too. And I think we'd all get along better, and we'd make a lot more progress if we could disagree and still have a conversation.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. Having said that, we can't, I suppose, maybe not so much, considering that in your line of work, you try to avoid the confrontation. But, I guess sometimes you can never, you can never be sure of someone's ability to accept the challenge, right? So, for example, if you challenge them, they might feel that it's antagonistic and it's confrontational.
Hmm.
How do you get them to, I guess, calm down from that situation and to appreciate that, it's we're trying to do it in a respectful way, and
Mm.
what's the best way we can get, to that the heart of the conversation?
Yeah, it's hard for me to speak from experience on that because I've never had an on-air
Yes.
confrontation like that. Primarily because I think we've always, as I've mentioned, we couch things. We speak to them before we start. We usually have an idea of where we're going, and so it's. I guess you'd have to find a way. But again, I mean, if someone's reacting to you in an angry way on air, then they've reacted to your tone of voice, or they've reacted to something you
Yeah.
said. But you've got 5 or 6 minutes. You want to get everything out. You can't always like make everything whole again before the end of your segment. Um, and if the subject matter needs to see something, some reaction like that, so you can sort of drive home the point of how serious or how polarized the views are,
Yeah.
then sometimes you can sort of just leave that there and say, okay, thank you so much for your time. We know you have very strong opinions on this, and then sort of move on. It's very rare because we're doing news bulletins. We're not doing
Right.
like long form interviews. You're
Right.
not able to go that much into the depth and meat and breadth of it. We are trying to sort of get the key points out. So I suppose it's a bit different. If you were doing like a one-on-one conversations with like that documentary that we have on CNA, where they ask really deep questions and really probing questions and really challenge the guests that we have on, they have a format that allows for that.
Yeah.
But for our format for the news, where we're trying to get, we have a 1 hour show and we've got 20 stories maybe to get through and 5 guests to get through, we don't have time to stop and get into that level of confrontation. Um,
Yeah.
but
And I think,
it's,
and I think you brought up something, from that maybe I'll take to heart as well, and that is, in a short amount of time, and with the information that you want to get from that person, I guess if they feel antagonized or they feel confronted, to always just pass on the fact that you have good intentions, and even though you don't have much time, it's just getting to the facts or the truth or the point of the discussion, so to speak, and then let the rest go.
yeah, that's right. And also just to add on to that, sometimes when you ask a question and they haven't really given you an answer, and you sort of ask the same question but in a slightly different way, and they're still not giving you an answer. By the third time, the audience is going to realize this guy doesn't want to answer that question,
Yeah.
which in itself is an answer. It tells you something, right?
Yes.
So you can't always get bogged down with, if this guy doesn't give me an answer, I'm not going to ask another. I'm going to keep asking until I get what I want. You kind of there comes to a point in time where everyone's at the understanding that that question isn't going to get answered in the way that maybe the viewers at home or myself at the desk would like
Yeah.
an answer for it, which in itself is also an answer.
Yeah. I'm curious. Maybe you have more insight to this than I. Well, you definitely do, I suppose. With the Western media, you see confrontational anchors like, okay, maybe confrontational is a strong word, but you get people like Mehdi Hassan or someone from the Fox News team, where they're always confrontational, and I'm curious. Are there any merits to that type of interviews and uh, truth-seeking endeavors?
Yeah, I guess it depends on the intention behind it. Like, what is the intention behind that line of questioning, and what is the goal of that? If it's to flush out someone's position, to try and get down to the real essence of what that person believes or that person thinks, then for sure you want to try and push some buttons and bring up something that they may previously have said, or ask them questions that are a bit more direct and to challenge them on their answers to do you say that, but what's your evidence for that, those sorts of questions. um, but it really depends on what is your outcome. Is your outcome for your viewer to be informed? Is your goal for them to go away being able to see all the different sides of an argument? I mean, ideally, in an ideal world, we journalists are there to uh, bring out the truth for people to understand, and you can argue whose truth are we talking about, but it's about being able to see both sides of the same coin. And with some networks that you mentioned, the confrontational nature of it, sometimes you wonder, is that just for the show, for the spectacle, or is
Yeah,
it genuinely to, or is it to push a narrative or to push an agenda?
yeah,
Because sometimes questions are asked and someone goes off on a rant for a minute and a half, and the host doesn't challenge them, may even agree with them. But you would think if someone has position A, then whoever's asking the questions has to sort of stand up for position B and push back a little bit, just to try and bring some sort of balance so you get a whole picture of a whole story.
yeah.
So it's yeah, it's a different places have different ways of doing that, I suppose.
Yeah. Um, I suppose it's a little bit off topic, but this is something that I've always wondered myself. Like, do you think there are benefits to those type of debate shows or debates? Because I can't imagine that they're actually listening to the merits of the opposing argument, right? Because their point is really just for victory, almost.
Well, conflict drives everything, right? Like if you watch a TV show or you watch a movie or any book that you read, the drama and the excitement and the interest is always driven by that conflict point.
Yeah.
So again, it comes back to, is your goal to inform people and for them to be well informed and to have a broad understanding of all the different views and the different aspects of a story, or is your goal just to sort of get eyeballs and people sort of sit back and be shocked by what people are saying? So
Right.
I mean, is there merit to it? I guess if you could do it in a way that it wasn't so much name calling and it was more fact based and reason based, then there's merit to it. If it's just purely for entertainment, then you either got to accept that this is entertainment and don't, put all your don't get all your information from that one source.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's a tough one. It really is, and it really doesn't help people be informed when they just hear such polarizing views and such antagonism. Because if we can't, I mean, it's fine. Like I was saying earlier, it's fine to disagree. You don't have to agree with everybody. But if you can't be civil about it and you can't, get along, then how can you move forward? We see sort of situations where the views are so far apart that they will disagree on anything, even something that is to the mutual benefit of both.
Right.
And then at that point, then where are we?
Yeah. That's a good point. Final question. Um, what if you could prescribe one practice that we could take from your experience to make us a little bit better at asking better questions? What would that be?
Be interested. Be interested in what they have to say. Be interested in the topic that they're talking about, because it's only when you really know what they know or know the subject matter that then the questions will sort of start coming out naturally. I mean, chances are, if you're in this business or you're in this industry, you're a naturally curious person. You want to know how things work. You want to know why things happen. You want to know why people think the way that they think. So if your chances are, if you already have that in you, that's probably, a natural sort of thing that you have, like for you
Right.
as well, asking me all these questions. You're curious, you want to know what other people know and how they think. So if you then put read up on the subject matter and take an interest in what you're talking about, the questions will naturally come from there, and you'll go, oh, so if that is how things are going with the current trend, then how did we get to this point? Like, what triggered this? Or is there going to be a change in direction soon? Because, the cycles of, if you're looking at the rise and fall of markets, for example, every 10 years, there seems to be something that sort of really shakes the landscape.
Yeah.
So, when you're speaking to business people, you might, ask them about, because you're not the expert, right? But if you're interested and you're hungry to learn, then the questions will naturally sort of fall into place. And then once you have that sort of, you're coming in with that. And if you approach your guest or your interviewee with the intention of trying to learn what they have to offer, not be completely naive and, but be wanting to hear what they have to say, then you're on your way to having a decent interview, because you're already informed and you're interested, and you're going to be asking the questions that your viewers will also be interested in, because they know that, okay, this guy's obviously been doing some research and paying attention, and okay, he's going to ask this guy some questions, so I'm going to be paying attention too. So I think being interested is a pretty important one, but there are many more.
Yeah, I'm sure. You kind of alluded to the others as well, right? Being informed as well. So that probably helps.
Yeah, actually, I know I've been talking a lot during this, and when people see me on air, I'm talking a lot as well.
Yeah.
But actually, most of my day is spent reading and listening.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
So I'm just, when we're at work, we're prepping for shows and stuff. We're just reading constantly of,
Yeah.
what the latest numbers are for COVID, for example, or how different countries are dealing with it in different ways. So I'm like 90% of my job is reading and listening, and the 10% is talking, and that's the 10% that people see.
Yeah. So you've really compressed the talking to just like one moment in your day, really.
Yeah, that's right. So usually when I come off air, that's it. I don't want to talk. I don't want to talk anymore. It's a good job when I finish work and I get home, everyone's asleep. So I don't have to talk to anybody.
That's awesome. So, final parting thing. I know you have a brilliant podcast. I really enjoy the podcast that you're on.
Good list, bad list. Yeah.
Yes. Maybe you can tell our listeners about it and how they can listen to it.
Absolutely. It's called Good List, Bad List. It's the idea is to take stories throughout the week that have happened. It's a weekly podcast. Usually comes out on a Wednesday, and is for myself and a couple of my fellow presenters. To sort of discuss the stories that have sort of got our attention in the newsroom. So some of them are quite heavy and quite serious. Some of them are quite light and quite fun. It's sort of the whole gamut. It's kind of a bit like if you were hanging out with myself and some of my colleagues after work, and you asked us, what are the big stories that you guys are talking about at work? Then that's the conversation that we're having. And we kind of try and sort of separate them into stories that we think go on the good list or the bad list.
Yeah.
The idea is not to be judgmental on the individuals at hand. You'll notice if you listen to the show, we don't put people themselves onto the bad list, but we put like the behavior or the action or the situation that we find ourselves in. Those are the things that we put on the bad list or the good list. But the idea is to also, by talking about them, to flush out all the different sort of aspects to the story, because although good list, bad list sounds like a very black and white issue, every story has lots of gray and lots of other different colors to it. So our intention is really to let listeners sort of join us for a chat, learn a bit more about the personalities behind the news, the way we think about them, the way we think about the stories. And so, we'll have little nuggets if we're talking about like the stay home notice or what's it called, home-based learning.
Yeah.
Then we're all in different chat groups with our different parent friends and things like that. So we bring out little anecdotes about how people are coping. So it's a very much sort of a behind the scenes look, I guess, of what the people that work in the news, what they're thinking about the news and talking about the news. And I started it in December, and we're doing it once a week now. And yeah, it's going along quite nicely. I'm glad you're tuning in. Thanks for mentioning it. It's we do have some sort of restrictions because of how our roster is sort of segregated because of the COVID-19. So we have sort of a small pool of presenters at the moment that I'm relying on, but hopefully as things loosen up and people can move more freely, we'll be able to get more of the morning team guys to come on the show a bit more as well.
Yeah, and that's one thing I really like about the podcast is because I think when you watch the news, you don't really get to hear your own personal thoughts on it, Whereas when you listen to the good list, bad list, what I appreciate is I mean maybe not fully, but I get a glimpse of how you guys are thinking about the situation as well. So I think that's my favorite part of it. So
Oh, thank you. I'm really glad you tune in and you listen because, like you mentioned, like when we're doing the news, the story is what it's about, right?
Yeah.
It's about getting the information out to our audience. Whereas the podcast, Goodness Bad List, is a bit more behind the scenes, a bit more just us being us and talking about the news. So
Yeah.
the intention is for people to get to know us a little bit better as well.
Yeah, it's a good initiative. So, well, thanks, Steve, for being on this podcast. I really appreciate it. And if there's anything else that is like really that I think I can pick your brain on, I'd love to have you back on
Oh
the
yeah,
show.
please. Yeah, anytime. It was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on, Nick.
Cheers, Steve.
Yeah, cheers.